What if genius wasn't something we learned, but something we remembered? What if the laws of the universe whispered their secrets, not through textbooks, but through dreams? Somewhere between the sacred and the scientific, between faith and reason, there once lived a man who didn't just study mathematics, he felt it. A man whose equations didn't merely solve problems, but sang of infinity itself. Tonight, we unravel the mystery of a soul touched by the divine and haunted by destiny. Srinivasa Ramanujan, the man who knew infinity. Before we begin this journey, make sure you subscribe, because here, we don't just tell stories. We resurrect the forgotten minds who changed the world and paid the price for it. It begins in 1887, in the small temple town of Kumbakonam, South India. A place of incense, smoke, and temple bells. Of barefoot priests chanting beneath mango trees, where mathematics was as distant as the stars. In a modest home of clay walls and flickering oil lamps, a child was born, thin, quiet, and curious, to a sorry shop clerk and a deeply spiritual mother. His name was Srinivasa Ramanujan. His mother believed he was chosen by the goddess Namagiri, a deity of dreams and wisdom. And perhaps she was right, because from the very beginning, the boy's mind did not belong to this world. While other children played in the streets, little Srinivasa sat in the courtyard, tracing numbers into the dirt with a stick. The neighbors laughed, calling him mad. But his eyes, dark, still unblinking, told another story. It was as if he saw something invisible, as if the universe itself was whispering its equations to him. To Ramanujan, numbers were not tools. They were living beings, divine symbols, each carrying meaning, emotion, even beauty. He would later say, "An equation for me has no meaning unless it expresses a thought of God." For him, mathematics was prayer, and every calculation an act of worship. By the time he was 10, his teachers had no idea what to do with him. He devoured mathematics like scripture, not memorizing, but understanding in ways that defied reason. While other students struggled through lessons, Ramanujan was discovering new paths on his own. When asked how he arrived at an answer, he would simply smile and say, "It came to me." To him, knowledge wasn't learned, it was revealed. But genius rarely fits inside a classroom. So the same system that praised his brilliance would soon brand him a failure. As a teenager, he became consumed by mathematics and only mathematics. He ignored every other subject, history, English, science, all meaningless compared to the divine rhythm of numbers. Exam after exam, he failed, not because he couldn't learn, but because he refused to learn anything else. The world began to close its doors. In an age when degrees defined destiny, Ramanujan had none. He was a dropout, brilliant but unemployable. His dreams seemed destined to die in the same small town where he was born. Then, at 17, fate revealed itself in the form of a book, a synopsis of elementary results in pure mathematics by George Carr. It wasn't a normal textbook. It was a dense compilation of thousands of formulas. No explanations, no proofs, just results. To most, it was useless. To Ramanujan, it was revelation. He studied it as though it were holy scripture. He copied every theorem, every symbol into his notebooks. And when he didn't understand something, he reconstructed it from scratch. From this single text, he built an entire world of mathematics, rediscovering ancient truths, inventing new ones, and reaching ideas far beyond his time. That book became his universe. For years, he worked alone, filling notebook after notebook with equations, often by lamplight in the stillness of night. He didn't know that some of what he was writing had already been discovered, or that others wouldn't be discovered for decades to come. To him, mathematics wasn't about history or credit. It was about revelation, about beauty. He wrote because he had to, because not doing so felt like silencing something divine. But brilliance doesn't feed a family. Poverty pressed down on him like an unending weight. His father's small income barely kept rice in the pot. Ramanujan often went hungry, his health frail, his future uncertain. He clutched his notebooks like sacred relics as he wandered through life, looking for someone, anyone, who might understand. His mother prayed for him, his friends pitied him, and his teachers dismissed him. Genius wasn't a word anyone used for a poor Indian boy scribbling equations in the margins of old papers. Yet, Ramanujan never stopped. He believed that his insights were divine, gifts from the goddess Namagiri herself. He claimed she came to him in dreams. She would write equations on my tongue, he said. And when I woke, they were there. Whether divine inspiration or the pure power of his mind, what he produced was extraordinary. His notebooks became a mirror of the infinite, filled with sequences, modular functions, continued fractions, and theories so advanced that even the greatest mathematicians of his time would struggle to comprehend them. He had no mentor, no institution, no recognition, but he possessed something far rarer, pure, unfiltered truth. He believed his discoveries would one day be understood, and so he kept writing. But hunger grows louder than faith. To survive, he took small tutoring jobs, earning barely enough to live. In his spare moments, he wrote letters to professors and scholars across India, enclosing his equations and pleading for them to look, to read, to see what he had found. Most ignored him. Some mocked him. One even returned his papers with the cruel note, "I am not sure if this man is a genius or a lunatic." But rejection couldn't silence him. He continued to write because his purpose was bigger than approval. Then in 1913, driven by desperation and a final flicker of hope, he sat down at his small wooden desk, lit by the dim glow of an oil lamp, and wrote a letter that would change his life and the history of mathematics. It was addressed to G.H. Hardy, one of the most respected mathematicians at Cambridge University. The letter began humbly. "I beg to introduce myself to you as a clerk in the accounts department of the Port Trust Office at Madras, who has made a special investigation in mathematics." Inside were 9 pages of equations, strange, elegant, otherworldly. There were no proofs, no explanations, no introductions, just raw genius on paper. When Hardy received the letter, he assumed it was a hoax. A poor Indian clerk claiming to have discovered new formulas in number theory seemed absurd. But something about the equations caught his attention. He showed the papers to his colleague, J.E. Littlewood, and together they studied them in silence. Within minutes, skepticism turned to astonishment. These weren't the works of a charlatan. They were the marks of brilliance. The formulas were beautiful, intricate, and profound, touching realms of mathematics that no European had ever reached. Hardy would later describe it as one of the most romantic moments in the history of mathematics. He said, "A poor clerk from India had written to me with results that must be true, because no one could have invented them." That single letter, written from a small room in Madras, traveled across oceans and shattered centuries of separation between East and West, between intuition and logic. Hardy realized he was looking at the work of a genius, perhaps one of the greatest mathematical minds of all time. He immediately began arrangements to bring Ramanujan to Cambridge, though it would be far from simple. For a devout Hindu like Ramanujan, traveling overseas was spiritually forbidden. And for an Indian under British rule, the barriers of class, culture, and race were steep. Yet, destiny had already begun to move. That one act of courage, sending a letter to a stranger, would alter the course of both their lives. 2 minds, born worlds apart, would soon collide. One grounded in rigorous proof, the other guided by divine intuition. Together, they would bridge the gap between the mystical and the logical, between faith and science. But Ramanujan didn't know any of that yet. As he sealed the envelope and watched it disappear into the postal box, he had no idea what awaited him. He didn't know that across the sea, someone was reading his work in awe. That night, he sat quietly in his small room. His ink-stained fingers rested on his notebooks. His mother's soft prayers drifted in from the next room. He didn't know if Hardy would ever reply. He didn't know if anyone would ever believe him. But he knew he had done what he was meant to do. He had sent his truth into the world. And somewhere across the water, that truth had found its echo. For now, Ramanujan remained in India, a young man surrounded by silence and uncertainty, unaware that his journey toward immortality had already begun. He was still the same boy who saw divinity in numbers, the same soul who believed that equations were the language of God. The world might have called him a failure, but history was preparing to call him something else entirely, a legend. This was not just the story of a mathematician. It was the story of a man who touched infinity and brought a piece of it back to us. The letter that began as a whisper from a small home in Madras soon echoed through the grand halls of Cambridge University. G. H. Hardy, already one of the most respected mathematicians in the world, couldn't ignore what he had read. The handwriting was humble, the phrasing awkward, but the ideas, they were breathtaking. Hardy recognized something that went beyond education, beyond method, something he couldn't quite explain. These formulas, he said, must be true, because if they were not, no one could have imagined them. For Hardy, this was not just mathematics. It was poetry written in numbers. And somewhere in India, a self-taught genius was waiting for an answer that would change everything. When Ramanujan received Hardy's reply, it was as if the heavens had opened. For the first time, someone had listened, someone who understood the language his mind spoke. Hardy invited him to Cambridge, offering him collaboration, guidance, and recognition. But for Ramanujan, the decision was not simple. Leaving India meant leaving his family, his faith, and his mother, the one person who believed his gift was divine. She saw England as a foreign, unholy land, a place where her son might lose not just his health, but his soul. Ramanujan hesitated. How could he leave the goddess who whispered to him? How could he leave the soil that had shaped his very spirit? But destiny is a force that doesn't wait for comfort or permission. After long months of struggle, his mother finally had a dream. She saw the goddess Namagiri telling her that her son must go, that his work belonged to the world. That vision changed everything. Ramanujan packed his notebooks, a few clothes, and his faith, and set sail for England. The year was 1914. The ship that carried him across the ocean also carried a storm within him. The sea was cold, foreign, and endless, a mirror of the unknown future waiting ahead. As the shores of India vanished behind him, so too did the warmth of home. He was a vegetarian in a land that would not understand it, a devout Brahmin entering a world of skeptics, and a dreamer stepping into the heart of scientific rigor. The voyage took weeks. He spent most of it sick, surviving on fruits and biscuits, often too weak to write. But through it all, his mind never stopped moving. Equations filled his thoughts like prayers, somewhere between the waves and the wind. Ramanujan began composing what he would later call his mathematical hymns. When he finally arrived in Cambridge, the contrast was jarring. The gray skies, the chill in the air, the unfamiliar faces. It was a world built on logic, hierarchy, and rules. And in the middle of it stood Ramanujan, wrapped in Indian robes, shy but radiant, carrying nothing but his notebooks. Hardy greeted him warmly, though others were skeptical. Many at the university couldn't fathom that a man with no formal education could have discovered anything meaningful. But Hardy knew better. He saw in Ramanujan's pages, not random guesses, but profound insights into the hidden structure of mathematics itself. He took him under his wing, and together they began one of the most extraordinary collaborations in history. Their partnership was more than just academic, it was almost philosophical. Hardy, the rationalist, believed in proof, precision, and order. Ramanujan, the mystic, believed in intuition, divinity, and beauty. To Hardy, every theorem needed a foundation. To Ramanujan, truth was self-evident. The results are there, he would say, because I see them. Their debates would stretch late into the night, chalk flying across blackboards, equations growing like vines on the walls. Hardy would ask, but how do you know this is true? Ramanujan would smile gently and reply, "Because the goddess showed me." It was not arrogance, it was faith. A kind of faith that mathematics, in its purest form, was not discovered, but revealed. Hardy once said that working with Ramanujan was like collaborating with a genius from another world. He would bring pages filled with wild, unproven theorems, formulas no one had ever seen before. And Hardy would spend weeks trying to decipher them. Some were wrong, many were right. But even those that were incorrect hinted at truths no mathematician had yet imagined. His mind, Hardy later wrote, was like a waterfall of ideas, unfiltered, unstoppable, and eternal. Together, they explored infinite series, number partitions, and modular functions. Their work would lay the foundation for discoveries that would shape future physics, computer science, and even string theory. Yet, beneath the brilliance, there was loneliness. Cambridge was not kind to outsiders. Ramanujan faced the silent racism of a colonial world that saw him as a curiosity, not an equal. His food was limited, his health fragile. The cold British winters bit into his bones. He refused meat, eggs, and many local foods, surviving mostly on vegetables and milk, often difficult to find. His body weakened, but his mind refused to slow down. Night after night, he would sit by the window of his small dormitory room, scribbling equations by candlelight, coughing between lines, but never stopping. Mathematics had become his breath, and he feared that if he stopped, even for a day, the divine voice inside him might fall silent. Despite the challenges, his reputation began to grow. Papers co-authored by Hardy and Ramanujan started to appear in the most prestigious journals. Mathematicians across Europe began whispering about the Indian prodigy who saw patterns in infinity that no one else could. Hardy often tried to teach him formal methods of proof, but Ramanujan resisted structure. He didn't see mathematics as a ladder to climb. For him, it was a field of stars to wander through freely. "You try to climb step by step," he once told Hardy, "but I go straight to the top of the tree." It wasn't arrogance, it was instinct. As World War I raged outside, Cambridge became a strange island of intellect, surrounded by chaos. Food was rationed, letters from home arrived months late, and the world seemed to crumble. Yet Ramanujan's devotion never wavered. But the isolation began to weigh heavily on him. He missed the sounds of temple bells, the warmth of sunlight, the comfort of prayer. The cold, damp air of England drained him, and he began to fall seriously ill. Tuberculosis, malnutrition, depression. The doctors couldn't decide which was worse. Hardy visited him often, urging him to rest. But how does a man rest when infinity is speaking through him? Even in the hospital, he filled pages with equations, proofs, and patterns, whispering them under his breath as if afraid they might vanish. Their friendship deepened through these hardships. Hardy was not an emotional man. He lived by reason, but with Ramanujan, something changed. He once said, "The greatest experience of my life was discovering the genius of Ramanujan." They could not have been more different. One a devout believer, the other a lifelong atheist. Yet together they forged a bond through the one language that transcended both faith and disbelief: mathematics. Hardy became not just a mentor, but a protector, trying desperately to shield Ramanujan from the skepticism of those who dismissed his work as mystical nonsense. But even Hardy could not protect him from the toll of illness and exile. By 1918, Ramanujan's health had deteriorated dangerously. He was in and out of hospitals, his weight dropping, his energy fading. Yet in those final Cambridge years, he produced some of his most profound work, results so advanced that modern mathematicians are still uncovering their depth today. His discoveries on Mach theta functions, partitions, and modular equations would influence entire generations of mathematical thought. It was as if, sensing his time was short, he was racing against mortality itself, trying to leave behind as much of the infinite as one human could. And through it all, he longed for home. In his letters, he wrote of dreams of India, the sound of rain on temple roofs, his mother's voice in prayer, the goddess who had once whispered theorems to him. Hardy could see it in his eyes. The light was fading. He arranged for Ramanujan's return, hoping the Indian sun might heal what English medicine could not. In 1919, frail but smiling, Ramanujan finally boarded a ship back to Madras. Hardy stood on the dock, watching as the vessel drifted away, perhaps knowing he was saying goodbye forever. He would later write that he had never met a mind so vast, nor a heart so gentle. When Ramanujan returned home, the air was warm, but his body was not. The tropical sun could no longer mend what England had broken. Yet even in his final days, lying on his bed too weak to stand, he continued to write, filling one last notebook with what he called Mach theta functions formulas, so advanced that their true significance wouldn't be understood until nearly a century later. He sent the manuscript to Hardy with a short note, humble as ever. "I've discovered some new functions which I think will interest you." A year later, on April 26, 1920, Srinivasa Ramanujan passed away at the age of just 32. The goddess's voice fell silent. But her echoes remained, in ink, in numbers, in the eternal symmetry of his equations. He died young, poor, and far from glory. But time has a way of redeeming those who lived for truth. His notebooks, once ignored and misunderstood, would become treasures, studied, revered, and celebrated by mathematicians for generations. Hardy, heartbroken, would later say that his greatest achievement in life was discovering Ramanujan. "It was," he wrote, "the one romantic incident of my life." He often wondered what might have been if Ramanujan had lived longer, how many secrets of the universe might have been unveiled. But perhaps, in some divine sense, Ramanujan had already given enough. In his 32 years, he bridged two worlds, reason and intuition, science and spirituality. East and West, he proved that knowledge has no nationality, that genius can rise from anywhere, and that the infinite can sometimes fit inside a single human mind. When Ramanujan's frail hands laid down the pen for the last time, it seemed as if a light had flickered out quietly in a small corner of Madras. The world barely noticed. Newspapers did not carry his name. The scientific elite did not mourn him. The empire that once doubted him remained unmoved. To them, he was just another story from the colonies. Brilliant, yes, but brief. Yet the truth was far more profound. What they didn't realize was that the light Ramanujan had carried would not fade with his death. It would scatter into equations, into minds, into generations yet unborn. He had walked into the infinite, leaving behind a trail of numbers that would guide others long after he was gone. After his death, his wife Janaki remained in quiet solitude in India, holding on to his notebooks, sacred pages filled with equations no one could yet understand. Hardy, back in Cambridge, was consumed by grief. He often said he never recovered from the loss. "Ramanujan's death," he confessed, "is the one tragedy of my life." For years afterward, he would revisit their old work, trying to piece together what his friend had left unfinished. But the scope of Ramanujan's mind was so vast, even Hardy struggled to comprehend it. "He left behind more theorems than proofs," Hardy once said. He knew the destination, but not always the path, because the path was not of this world. The world slowly began to rediscover him. Decades passed, wars came and went, empires fell, and yet, in dusty archives across Cambridge and Madras, his notebooks remained, silent, waiting. In 1927, a mathematician named G.N. Watson and his colleague B.M. Wilson took up the monumental task of editing Ramanujan's papers. They tried to make sense of the thousands of formulas, many of which had no explanation or precedent. But even they, brilliant as they were, found themselves lost. Ramanujan's work seemed to belong to a mathematics of the future, not the present. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the world finally began to catch up. In 1976, a mathematician named George Andrews from Penn State University was visiting the Wren Library at Trinity College, Cambridge. While browsing through old manuscripts, he stumbled upon something extraordinary. A stack of yellowing pages labeled Ramanujan's lost notebook. It contained hundreds of formulas Ramanujan had written in the last year of his life, most of them dealing with mysterious Mach theta functions. Andrews realized instantly that he was holding something monumental, the final thoughts of a man who had glimpsed infinity. That discovery reignited the study of Ramanujan's mathematics around the world. It was as if 50 years after his death, Ramanujan had sent one last letter from beyond the grave. And what a letter it was! Mathematicians pored over those pages and found that many of the formulas corresponded with concepts that would not even be discovered until the late 20th and early 21st centuries, ideas that connected to quantum physics, black hole entropy, and string theory. Roger Penrose, one of the greatest living physicists, once said that some of Ramanujan's work seems to come from a realm beyond human thought, something almost transcendental. Even today, his equations are being used to understand the behavior of particles at the edge of the universe, to decode the geometry of space and time, and to explore the mathematics behind chaos itself. It's astonishing to think that a man who died in 1920 with no access to formal education, no modern tools, no recognition, somehow reached into the same mysteries that modern science still struggles to grasp. He saw patterns in the infinite, structures in the void. He looked into numbers and found the divine. He once said, "An equation has no meaning for me unless it expresses a thought of God." For him, mathematics wasn't a craft, it was prayer. Every theorem was a hymn. Every discovery a communion. His faith and his genius were one and the same. And yet, for all his brilliance, Ramanujan's story is not just about mathematics. It's about the tragedy and beauty of human potential. How genius can bloom in obscurity. How truth can be ignored until it is undeniable. It's a story about how faith and logic, east and west, intuition and proof can coexist, not as enemies, but as halves of the same whole. Hardy once wrote that he believed in nothing divine, but Ramanujan made him doubt that disbelief. Sometimes, Hardy admitted, "I wonder if a mind like his could really have been created by chance." Even now, more than a century later, Ramanujan's name carries a kind of reverence among mathematicians, whispered with awe, studied with humility. His formulas are still being deciphered, still revealing new truths. The infinite he glimpsed hasn't ended. It continues to unfold, piece by piece, through the minds of those he inspired. He is not just a figure of history, he's a living force in modern science. In the small town of Kumbakonam, where he was born, his home has been turned into a museum, a quiet shrine to the boy who spoke to infinity. Tourists and scholars alike visit, standing before the modest desk where he once wrote his theorems on scraps of paper. On the walls hang photographs of a frail, gentle man with deep, thoughtful eyes. To most, he looks ordinary. But for those who understand, that room holds the spirit of something vast, a reminder that genius can rise from anywhere, that even in the darkest corners, light can find a way to shine. Hardy lived another 20 years after Ramanujan's death. In his later years, he wrote an essay titled A Mathematician's Apology, where he reflected on the beauty of mathematics and the melancholy of age. It's a deeply personal work, but in it, one name stands above all others. Hardy writes, "I have done nothing worth remembering except for my association with Ramanujan." For a man who spent his life surrounded by proofs and logic, that statement was his confession. That the one thing that gave his life meaning was friendship with someone who seemed to exist between worlds. The relationship between Hardy and Ramanujan stands as one of the most extraordinary collaborations in human history. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Two men, separated by culture, belief, and experience, found common ground in the most abstract and divine language humanity has ever known. Their story reminds us that truth doesn't belong to one civilization or another. It belongs to those who seek it fearlessly, relentlessly, and with humility. In recent years, Ramanujan's story has inspired books, documentaries, and even films. Yet no screen or page can fully capture the mystery of his mind. He was more than a mathematician. He was a bridge between the seen and the unseen, between logic and faith. His equations were not mere symbols. They were echoes of a consciousness that dared to dream beyond the boundaries of understanding. And perhaps that's what makes him timeless. Because even now, when mathematicians look at his work, they don't just see numbers, they see wonder. The kind of wonder that humbles the intellect and elevates the soul. The kind that reminds us that every discovery, no matter how rational, begins with a question, a whisper from the unknown. Maybe that's what Ramanujan left us, not just formulas, but a way of seeing. To look at the universe not as something cold and mechanical, but as something alive, divine, and infinite. To believe that inspiration can come from anywhere, from gods, from dreams, from the quiet corners of the human mind. To understand that sometimes the most extraordinary truths emerge from the most ordinary lives. Because Ramanujan wasn't born into privilege, he wasn't taught by the world. He was guided by something within, something the world couldn't name, but everyone could feel. And that's why his story still matters. It's not just about mathematics. It's about faith in one's vision, perseverance in the face of doubt, and the courage to listen to the voice within when no one else can hear it. And maybe that's why, even a century later, his presence still lingers. In classrooms, in equations, in the hearts of those who chase knowledge not for fame, but for truth. Because every time a young mind dares to think differently, to challenge what's known, to trust an intuition no one else understands, that's Ramanujan, whispering again from the infinite. So, the next time you look at the stars, or at a piece of art, or even at a simple equation that feels too beautiful to explain, remember, beauty itself is a kind of proof. Proof that the universe is more than we can measure. Proof that sometimes the greatest minds don't just understand the infinite, they become part of it. And if you've made it this far into this story, then maybe, somewhere inside you, the same spark exists. The desire to know, to question, to believe. So don't let the world's doubt define your limits. Let curiosity be your compass. Let wonder be your guide. Because, as Ramanujan showed us, sometimes one person's faith in their vision can change how the entire world understands infinity. If stories like this move you, if you believe the forgotten pioneers deserve to be remembered, then join us. Subscribe to Pioneers in the Dark, where we bring light to the minds that shaped our world from the shadows. Because the universe is full of infinite stories, and together we'll uncover them one at a time.